Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another Geo-Institute live stream. You are looking live behind me at the backyard of the palatial Keeler Estate in Northern Virginia, doing this from home today. It's our fourth
Hello again,
episode
everybody, and welcome to another
Geo-Institute. And you might say to yourself, what does that mean? Well, this is our show that's all about publications, and we wanted to make some kind of pun that was appropriate for geotechnical engineering and geology, and hence books rock. So we do this show quarterly to expose you to new publications in the geotech and more generally civil engineering field. My name is Brad Keeler. I'm the director of the Geo-Institute. And again, we welcome you to our presentation today. If you don't know anything about the Geo-Institute, after you watch this here broadcast today, you should head over to geo-institute.org, and there you will find out many things about us, including that we are a technical society with about 12,000 members, most of whom are geotechnical engineers and or geologists, and that we are part of the American Society of Civil Engineers. And if you like what you see today, and Craig, I feel like this book has been relatively successful, so the people should like what they see today. Naveed's a pretty funny guy. They should like what they see today. You should click like, subscribe, and get notifications, and we will let you know every time we post something to the YouTube channel. One more note before we hear a little bit more about publications is I have here in my left hand the Ralph Peck bobblehead. Well, it's not the Ralph Peck bobblehead, it's a Ralph Peck bobblehead. We have a few hundred of these guys in the office in Reston, and if you would like to obtain one for your very own, here's what you need to do. Head to geo-institute.org and click on the link in the top right that says student participation fund or something like that. Maybe give to students. I really should have been better prepared for this. Make a donation of at least $96 or more, because we were founded in 1996, and you will receive a Ralph Peck bobblehead in your mailbox to call your own. There are many other great thank you gifts. We're trying to match the gift of Jean-Louis and Janet Briot of $500,000 to GI student programs so that we can permanently endow our fund. Wouldn't you like to be a part of that? I think you would. If you have any questions, just reach out and we'll tell you. Now, let's talk about today's programming. First up, to tell you about the book and about ASCE publications, which are two very important things. It is Leslie Connolly. Leslie, thank you for being here with us, and tell the people what you're going to tell them.
Sure, happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen and show you the book. This is what we're talking about today. I'm from the ASCE publications team, and ASCE is the leading publisher of civil engineering content, so that includes books, standards, and conference proceedings. The book that we're talking about today is from the Infrastructure Resilience Division. It's one of our IRP book series. And this one focuses on risk, resilience, measurements, civil infrastructure and lifeline systems, and community resilience to natural and other hazards. So as the slide shows you, we are offering a 10% discount if you use this code ASCE Pub 2025. The book is only available on risk, resilience, so you need to go to the library, which civil infrastructure on the screen, ascelibrary.org, and you can find the book there. Thank you very much.
That is amazing. Thank you, Leslie. A 10% discount just for being here and for typing 11 measly characters into a little box on the screen. What a deal. Now you're going to hear a little bit more about the book. And that does remind me of one thing. Craig, at some point, you need to tell the people watching about IRD as well. We can do a little infomercial for that. To introduce Craig, tell you a little bit about him. Memphis' own. From Texas A&M University, where he is a faculty member, it is Naveed Jafari. Naveed, thank you for moderating us today.
Thank you, Brad. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited about this book and to be here for Craig to present some of what is inside of this book and motivate you to explore and get this book. Dr. Craig Davis, let me do a quick intro, is a professional consultant on geotechnical, earthquake, and lifeline infrastructure system resilience engineering. Part of that is he's a licensed civil and geotechnical engineer in the state of California. Before being a consultant, he worked 32 years at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power Water System, LADWP, serving as on a couple of different roles, serving from departmental chief resilience officer, resilience program manager, seismic manager, geotechnical engineering manager. Part of all of that, he developed a comprehensive LA water system resilience program and is involved in creating policy of improving infrastructure systems to threats and hazards. He served on many national and international committees for geotechnical infrastructure engineering. Through all of his work and as kind of an accomplishment of his career, he's been honored with the ASCE 2016 Laval Lund Award for practicing lifeline risk reduction and the 2020 Charles Martin Duke Lifeline Earthquake Engineering Award. And that's not all. He's been very active in publications, 185 technical papers, books, and contributions, in addition to coordinating a lot of international workshops and symposiums on lifeline infrastructure system resilience. With that, Craig, it's a pleasure to have you here and to have you present some of what you know about this book and why we should be getting it.
All right. Thank you, Naveed. Let me share my screen. And thank you, Brad and Leslie. So maybe tell me when you see the screen. I know there's a slight delay.
Yes, Books Rock.
All right. So welcome to Books Rock. What I'm going to talk to you today is about this book introduced to you called Infrastructure System Resilience, an Engineering Framework for Assessment, Management, and Governance. It is published by the Infrastructure Resilience Division, and it was worked on in collaboration with the Japan Society of Civil Engineers. So this is a good opportunity to introduce the Infrastructure Resilience Division as suggested by Brad. Thank you, Brad, for pointing that out. I had been overlooking that. So the Infrastructure Resilience Division, sometimes we go by the IRD. It was created several years ago by consolidating several other units with the idea that resilience is becoming a really important aspect relative to the infrastructure systems that ASCE commonly addresses. I'll speak a little bit more about that as part of this book because it's kind of embedded. But we have an executive committee and several other committees, the Civil Infrastructure and Lifeline Systems Committee, the Risk and Resilience Measurements Committee, the Event Investigations Committee, one we call SPEED, which is, what is that? The Social Policy, Education, and several other things that we group together that are interrelated, that tend to move and need to be integrated with engineering, but they deal more with things that engineers need to collaborate with rather than what we commonly and necessarily do ourselves. And all of these work together to try to collaborate with all the other units within ASCE to integrate the concepts of resilience that we need to improve our entire nation as well as the rest of the world. And we do work internationally as identified by this particular book, where we work with the Japan Society of Civil Engineers who are actually trying to achieve the same goals. So that's it on the Infrastructure Resilience Division, but if you have more comments or any questions on that, happy to take them. So this book is available at the bookstore, as already introduced. And on this slide, I'm also showing some additional background information that is accessible to you that help support the information within the book. One of those is a video that will give you much more detail than what I'm going to be able to give to you today. It is available at this link. And another one is a symposium that we prepared during the years while we were working on creating this book. And that symposium addresses the application of this framework, as well as detail underlying different chapters and aspects within this book. So I encourage you to take a look at these links if you're interested, and I'll give you some other paper references towards the end of this presentation. So I would be remiss without doing diligence on the acknowledgements. Of course, I need to acknowledge the tremendous efforts of Yuki Shibuya from the Japan Society of Civil Engineers and Catherine Tehan from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Without their work and their strong support, this book would not be possible. And with the United States and Japan, there were many people, these are the primary co-authors, but there are many people that we need to acknowledge. I won't take the time to say each by name, but you can see them here and you'll be able to look at them again and on the replay of this if you need. This is the infrastructure resilience framework that should be on your screen now. It is a little bit complicated diagram to fit everything in, but what it shows are the 8 elements that make up the framework, along with the flow process and images and icons that are intended to help you visualize what's going on. Now, in the book, there are actually detailed descriptions of what these images are trying to relate to for you and how it describes, along with the image, there's descriptions on how each part of the framework fits together and how these images support each of the elements. I am not going to be able to get into that level of detail. So if you're interested in what these images are intending to portray to you, I recommend that you refer to the background information that I've already pointed out to you as reference, and the book itself would be best to get that level of detail. Now, you can get a much more simple diagram, which is also presented in the book. This diagram presents the same information, but without the icons and the diagrams. So you can see it in a much more simpler form, but that's not what I'm going to do today. I'm going to use this more complicated diagram and walk you through each of the elements to identify what the framework is about and how all of the elements fit together to give this bigger picture of what infrastructure system resilience is all about. So let's get started with that on element 1. So element 1 is, I have something in my way here. So can you still see the screen? Hopefully I didn't turn off the share screen.
No, that's great.
Okay, great. So I had a little icon in front of my diagram, so I needed to clear that out. So element 1 is the infrastructure resilience domain. What this is showing, which really is the core of what the infrastructure resilience division is all about as well. This is one of our guiding images that we use to understand what is infrastructure resilience. Well, we're trying to simplify the very complicated notion and multidimensional idea of what resilience is into 3 main elements, and not elements, but I shouldn't use the word elements, but 3 main dimensions. So the systems, the hazards, and adverse event cycle. So the systems include buildings, in this case, building clusters, which are groups of buildings serving common purpose like medical. And then there's water, wastewater, transportation, solid waste management, liquid fuels, natural gas, flood control, flood protection, electric power, and communication. So those are the main topics of what we mean by infrastructure in this book. Then there are the hazards. We list a lot of different hazards. That horizontal row titled hazards is not intended to be comprehensive. That's what the series of dots are on the far right side and the upper right is all about. Then there's the event cycle. That includes planning, preparation, mitigation, response, recovery, and rebuild. So the idea is that you would work on one or more of these infrastructure systems to one or more of the hazards and address all of the issues associated with the event cycle. Now, if you look at this simplified diagram of just 3 dimensions, you might be thinking, well, I understand resilience to be multi-dimensional, much more than just those 3. Well, it is, but what we're trying to do is say, let's start by focusing on these 3, and then when you take those 3 points, right, in a 3-dimensional diagram, you create a locus, which you can see one example of that in the lower left portion of the center part of that 3-dimensional diagram that lists flood, communications, and planning. That would be the locus for those issues, and within that box reside all of the other dimensions, which will be engaged as you work through the different elements in the framework. So element 1, these dimensions in element 1 feed directly into element 2, which is the building and lifetime infrastructure system performance and functionality. That incorporates the aggregate of the entire set of components and subsystem performances that make up the system as a whole. So we're really talking about the entire system and everything that makes it up. So those can degrade over time and reduce performance, which is the curved nature in this diagram that you see. It's intended to be the degradation. When a hazard strikes, you could lose some level of functionality or performance, and that drops, and then you intend to recover that over time. And that to do that analysis, it requires data and tools, which the data and tools come from the management and governance section. In fact, you know what? I forgot a very important step in this. I'm going to step back just for a second and then get back to where I was. So this diagram as a whole, it is cut through the middle. You can see right here in the middle a line, with the upper part being system assessments and the lower part being management and governance. There is a legend to this diagram that includes processes, tools, and outcomes, respectively, in tan, blue, and green colors. There are the flow process, which is the important part that I apologize for skipping that at the beginning. The flow process is identified by the arrows and the interconnects of the orange lines that cross that middle portion between management and governance and the upper part of system assessment. So the gray lines are the flow for the system assessment. The blue lines are the flow for the management and governance. And the orange lines interlink the information that goes either way between assessment to management and governance, or vice versa, back from management and governance up to assessment. So with that information, we start with element 1, which then flows to element 2 that I just described. And then element 2 requires the data and the tools, which comes from the management and governance portion. And think of each of these, the screen, identifying one system. You're just thinking of one system, but there are a series of parallel screens, if you will, covering all of the other systems. So, for example, if you're wanting to evaluate water and earthquakes, then you would have an earthquake that affected the system, but the water system, but that earthquake would also affect the electric power system and might shut off power to the pumps. The pumping system might not be damaged, but might not have power from that earthquake. And so you need to worry about the dependencies and how that affects. So element 2 then feeds into elements 3 and 4. Element 3 being shown on the upper right is the system service provision and operability. So the effects on functionality, which is how each system component is able to perform, may or may not affect the ability to provide services. So you still can have damage, but still be able to provide services, or that damage from the event or the loss of resources because of the event may affect the ability to provide services. But functionality and services are not the same thing. And that's a key aspect of this framework, that we need to understand that. Now, if you do have an effect on the ability to provide services from the network in the infrastructure system, then we need to worry about the continuity of services. How do people get services when they can't go, again, using water as an example, when they can't go to the tap and get their cup of water or anything like that? So we need to worry about how those people will get services, which might be through alternate ways, like a bottle of water. Might be able to, you can't flush the toilet maybe, but you need to use portable toilets, emergency generators for electric power and stuff like that. So that's what element 4 is all about. And then those elements 3 and 4 feed into the social and economic activity. So it's either as commonly done through the network, and if it can't be done through the network, it's either done through alternate services or it has to be delayed or deferred. And then element 6 is fed from element 5. So the community, well-being, equity, and livability, and so on, is affected by the ability to have social and economic activity. Then elements 5 and 6 flow to, whoops, almost forgot. So let's step back a second. So the elements 2, 3, and 4 are the core infrastructure resilience elements. Elements 4, 5, and 6 are the core community resilience elements. Element 4, if you may have noticed when I just explained that, is a key crossover element that is incorporated in both the infrastructure and the community, because without the services from the infrastructure system, the community still needs services. For example, if you don't have bottled water, if it can't get it out of the tap through the network, people may perish after about 2 to 3 days. Well, we don't want that. So there's got to be an alternate way of providing certain key services to the community, even if there's an effect on the services provided out of the network as normal. So then elements 5 and 6 feed into the management and governance, and so that they can establish the community performance objectives based on the information attained from these assessments that I just described. Element 7 feeds to, going the wrong way. Element 7 feeds to element 8 to define infrastructure system performance, which supports the social and economic needs of the community. Then from after element 8, that's the end of the number of elements, the key elements within the framework. But at that point, we should be able to compare the performance objectives that are established based on what the community needs with the assessments that are being made of the system itself. If the system, based on different levels of and types of hazards, can always meet the performance objectives, then we're done. If not, which is commonly the case, you need to go back and iterate through this process to identify what needs to be changed, either to the hardened and built infrastructure and or to the organizations and the people and the groups and everything within that organization that operates that infrastructure system. And commonly you need to affect both of those through mitigation and policy and actions to be able to equate the ability to perform with the needed performance. Okay, so then elements 7 and 8 support the outcomes of policy based on these assessments. Element 8 directly supports the social and economic losses and the economics of resilience. So at the macro scale, you would address the social and economic losses and what is acceptable and how do you prevent them. And on the microeconomic scale, you would have the economics of resilience and can you afford to make these improvements and mitigations and changes that I just described by iterating through this framework and its processes. So I mentioned earlier the need for data and tools. Well, that is developed through the management and governance side of things, but it supports every aspect of this framework. And then lastly, to apply the framework, you can do this in whole by taking it very comprehensively and applying it across every element that I just described, or you can do it in part by taking one or a few of the elements. Now, if you do it in part, then you need to understand which part you're working with and how it interrelates with all of the other elements. And then lastly, the framework, if you might have noticed, I did not identify how you apply the computational tools. There are computational tools either at a conceptual level or a very advanced level that can be applied to each of these elements or multiple of them in combination. Now, throughout this description, I had references in that diagram, which are listed here for you. And then there are some additional infrastructure resilience resources for papers that have been identified. For example, this top one is a recent paper published in the ASCE Journal of Infrastructure Systems on why a framework to engineer infrastructure resilience is necessary. And the other two are further background documents that you might want to refer to if you're interested. And with that, I will conclude and somehow try to unshare my screen. So Naveed, I hand this back over to you. Am I still sharing?
No, Craig, you're not. This is good.
Okay.
Excellent. So before I begin, I do want to make the announcement that if you have questions, please put them in the chat and Brad will relay them to us and Craig can answer them. So I always like to do the awkward silence to make sure my students ask questions. And what we'll do is while we wait for you to submit questions, if you have any, I'll ask Craig a couple of questions myself because I'm actually quite interested in this topic. Having lived in Louisiana and been through 4 to 5 hurricanes and still living in the Gulf Coast and still on my mind whenever we approach hurricane season, which is right around the corner again. So let's start with this concept of resilience. I think is used a lot. But what I'd like to ask you, Craig, is if you had to explain infrastructure system resilience to a 5th grader, how would you describe it, right, in layman's terms?
Yeah, so that's maybe a little difficult with all of the different aspects of resilience. But I would say, because I have a 5th grader grandchild. So I think if I was explaining it to my grandson, I would try to keep it simple and say infrastructure resilience or infrastructure systems include water, wastewater, electric power, transportation, buildings, and so on. And these systems provide the services that rely on, like turning on the tap and getting the water, turning on the switch and getting the lights. But large storms and earthquakes can affect the ability for those systems to provide those services to us that we expect on a normal and daily basis. And infrastructure resilience provides the ability to restore those services that we rely upon in a timely manner. So the idea that I would be trying to portray to the 5th grader is that resilience is all about restoring service, bouncing back.
Okay.
If I were to go beyond the 5th grade, I do want to say something else because I get this question a lot. And that is that, the definitions of resilience talk about preparedness and so on. And I even talked about that in the presentation. But the idea of resilience is bouncing back. You can't really bounce back if you weren't prepared before the event. So the idea of bouncing back inherently requires us to mitigate, to be prepared, to make plans and do all that other stuff. So for this audience, I wanted to add that in the vid as well.
Absolutely. I mean, whenever you talk about bouncing back, I tend to think of New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina of a case where things didn't bounce back, at least to what was before, right? And it's stunning when you actually go to the scene and you see that. You could probably make that case as well for a lot of coastal Louisiana with a lot of the hurricanes they've had. Well, so we know that resilience is very much a personal thing as well. So I wanted to ask you, is there a moment in your life or an event where it finally kind of clicked for you personally, this idea of resilience or this concept of it?
Oh, yeah. Since January 17th, 1994, I have thought about this every single day. I was thrown out of my bed at 4:31 a.m. in the morning from the Northridge earthquake. And that has driven the rest of my life. I think about that all the time. I had 2 kids in the house and we were shaking violently. I was in the area of some of the most violent shaking. And I couldn't even walk. It was shaking so bad. Well, I worked, as mentioned earlier in my bio, I worked for the LA Department of Water and Power. So my job was, as a civil engineer there, was to help identify what was affected, make the repairs so that we can restore the services. We lost water. I worked on the water side of LA Department of Water and Power. We lost power to it for the first time ever to the entire city and also 5 other states just because of the earthquake in Los Angeles. And that was a moderate sized earthquake. It's not a large San Andreas event. And it was difficult to make these recoveries to the 750,000 people that lost water in less than 10 seconds. Right. So, I mean, what we had to deal with is larger than most cities in this country, in fact, around the world as well. And so it was rather an enormous task, but it's difficult to do when you have fires, when the bridges are down and you don't have transportation, you don't have electric power. So how do you do this, and how do you coordinate across all of these things just so that you could restore these services to the people that need it? And it becomes a dire effect on the needs for this. So this became very personal to me, to be able to see how this affected. And that's actually where I got my PhD, was studying this stuff after the Northridge earthquake.
Okay, I think questions are coming in. So I'm going to stop asking questions. I'm going to go straight to some questions from the audience, Craig. And so what I'm seeing here from Sean is, can you indicate who should be implementing different components of the process to achieve resilience? So who should be implementing?
Yeah, so that's kind of an open question. This topic is about infrastructure resilience. So I'm going to be talking about who in the infrastructure side, but in elements 5 and 6, we actually talk about a bigger issue of community resilience. So the idea of the framework is how do you link, or the bigger picture is that we're really all striving to have resilient communities. But you can't have resilient communities without having resilient infrastructure systems. So how do you create resilient infrastructure systems is the focus of this book. So I'll start with that, and then I'll kind of broaden it out in case the questioner was thinking in the bigger picture. So the infrastructure systems, the managers and the people who govern them need to be thinking about how and what to do and how to do it for each of the elements within this framework. So it all fits within the leadership. Maybe it's at the state level, maybe it's the county level, maybe it's the infrastructure level itself, right? So the infrastructure managers also do govern that infrastructure system, as well as management and governance are not the same thing. So they need to be figuring out what to do. They need to be the ones directing their planners, whether it's in-house staff or consultants, their designers and their operators, and all of them need to work together using these elements every step of the way. They need to make the decisions on what is their performance criteria. So I use Northridge earthquake, and I think of that a lot, but if you're expecting an earthquake like we would in California, well, how long is it that's acceptable to recover the water services in my particular case, in my example? Is it 30 days? Is it 2 days? Is it different for a hospital than it is a recreational park? The answer there is yes. And so who has to make those decisions? Well, that gets into the broader community. So when does a hospital need it? Well, they might not need it on day 1, but they might need it on day 2. If they actually have their own water storage tank of potable water, maybe they don't need it for 3 days. So you got to work with the community. And who in the community, and how does the community get this? If they can't get it because they can't afford it by fixing the water system and investing there, how are they going to get that water within 3 days before people begin to perish? Mm-hmm. The emergency managers, the mayors, the leadership, and the rest of the community need to be engaging to figure that out and assigning that to the appropriate people. And so this expands really quick, which I'm going to stop here. But I'm trying to give you the vision that everybody has to get engaged somehow, some way.
Good, because there's multiple questions here. So I only wanted to add the first part, so that way we don't lose track. So then the second part of the question from Sean is, I also think of what qualifications these people should have. And is independence important? Now, independence is all caps. And I'm not sure exactly where independence would be, if that makes sense to you, Craig. Independence of...
I have an interpretation of that, but I'm not sure it's what Sean is meaning, so maybe Sean can follow up. But so I would take independence of... I worked for 32 years for a water agency, a city municipality that provided the water. In that context, independence usually is somebody doing an independent oversight and taking a look, or maybe you don't want staff to do it, so you hire a consultant. And I would suggest in that context, you don't want complete independence, because there's so many intricate things that go on within a large and complicated infrastructure system, because every one is large and complicated, even in a small city. There's things that are never known by the consultants or the independent reviewers. So then you end up missing key information on how to appropriately implement things. And so you said something, Naveed, about prior to independence that I think I'm overlooking.
Which is, this sounds a very hard problem with a lot of complications. What qualifications should people have? Like, what do people need to know to be able to do this?
Yeah, the qualifications. One, you need to understand how hazards, and I'm mostly focusing on natural hazards, but you can also take human-caused hazards, how they are generated, the mechanisms associated with it. Like a hurricane you were bringing up, it's not just wind. Right? There's storm surge, there's rain, there's flooding associated. There's actually tornadoes associated with a hurricane, right? So there's all these things, and then the wind causes flying debris, right? So there's hazards upon hazards, and the floating debris that comes in. It's not necessarily the force of the water. Sometimes it's the ship that's in the water that causes the problem, right? So all of these things, and then like earthquakes and hurricanes and other floods, there's sometimes flood or fire following these things, or even fire during these things. And so another hazard. So you need to the qualifications, that people need to understand the hazards themselves and the effects that they can cause to the system. They need to understand the fragilities of the different components and what that means to these when they're exposed to these different hazards. They need to understand how the system operates. And when you lose certain aspects of that system, certain functionality, does that prevent you from providing services? Because, and this is really important, and this is where a lot of researchers miss out, because they don't operate the system. People want to talk a lot about functionality, but you might lose a lot of functionality. But if you have redundancy and isolation capabilities, maybe that doesn't prevent the system from providing the services. For example, you might have two electric lines coming from two completely different sources, two different generators. You might lose one, but that doesn't mean you've lost power to anybody, because you have the other one. If it's not damaged, you might still be able to provide it. So it's not just functionality. We've got to think about the services. So it's actually all about the services and how they're provided. So I could go on and on and on with that, but I'm hopefully portraying the right idea of the qualifications that the people need to have. So just somebody with a brand new idea that has no knowledge on this stuff doesn't necessarily mean that their ideas work. However, maybe it does, right? So you should pay attention and work with everybody and process the information, because it is really complicated. And sometimes things work from people who don't have these qualifications, and sometimes they don't.
Perfect. Okay, so we've got another comment from Sean. Excellent answers. Independence was intended to mean avoidance of personal and corporate self-interest. You answered that well. Thank you. Awesome. Okay. Well, Sean, thank you for the questions. All right, so as we wait for those in the audience to put some more questions, we can always go back to some of our own personal experiences with resilience. I remember, this is just anecdotal, when I was buying my home in Baton Rouge, first home in Baton Rouge, and the original owner put in a home generator back in 2008 as it related because of Hurricane Gustav, where Baton Rouge lost power for 1 to 2 weeks, obviously during the summertime, not an ideal situation. And I distinctly remember, I was like, I don't understand why I need to have a home generator. This is, it was 2019. It's, 2019, and we have modern power grids, power station, the grid. everything is modernized. I don't see me losing power. Why would I lose power? And I would say that home generator has saved me so many times the past 5 years. Whenever something would happen, whether it was a hurricane or a cold freeze, you automatically had the resilience, right? Because when you think about you're going to drop down, there was never a drop down. You just keep going business as usual because you made that preparation, that investment beforehand that you would never lose power. And it was amazing how important that home generator was. And what was even more fascinating, Craig, is that by the time I left Louisiana, I would say the majority of my neighborhood had home generators. You could hear the buzzing on the streets of personal home generators, ones that are actually wired into the home. And so it's fascinating time when it comes to power and self-reliance and resilience. Awesome. So let's keep going. I don't see any questions just yet, but we've got some questions prepared. Related to the International Infrastructure Resilience Framework, why did the Japanese the Japanese Society of Civil Engineering and the American ASCE Infrastructure Resilience Division, why did they come together to work together and develop this?
Well, that was, being told that the JSCE actually reached out to us. And if you know anything about Japan, they deal with a lot of different hazards. And they found that there was a struggle within their community to understand and implement this notion of resilience. Right? It's multidisciplinary, it's multi-hazard, it's multi-everything. And it is a little bit complicated. And there began a conversation was sparked up, and we were pointing out that we're experiencing the same thing. And many of the people, if any of you know the people on the list of contributors here that I showed early in the presentation, and myself, I've done a lot of international work and exploration. It's common around the world. Some do a little bit better than others, but they have problems with these notions in Europe and in New Zealand and everywhere. So we said, why don't we work together? And if we can come up with something amongst ourselves, it probably, the infrastructure systems are similar. They're not so different in the countries. Modern infrastructure systems are modern infrastructure systems. They're pretty much the same. Every water system in the United States is a little bit different, just like every water system in Japan is a little bit different. But on gross, they're the same. Right. Essentially the same. So if we can come up with something, and then we had this common notion that we found as we were talking about it, that we believed that we could come up with a series of processes and elements that were general across most, if not all, hazards and all infrastructure systems. So we started individually working out different things and drafted out this framework and ended up massaging it as we went on. And you noticed I gave references to other presentations because we had gone out and reached out to ASCE members and conferences and symposium, and JSCE, same thing, and had invited international players as well from Canada, from New Zealand, from all over the world, actually, Europe, and got feedback in this process that eventually got massaged into what I presented.
Perfect. So I think I was going to ask you how you actually went about doing the developing of the framework between yourselves and the Japanese. I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add there. But I could ask.
I think between this and presentation, I probably covered the meat Perfect. Of what.
So another question that we have is what's next in the workload pipeline for Infrastructure Resilience Division?
Well, there's a lot of people doing different things, so I can't get into the detail on some of the others because I'm no longer part of the executive committee, but I can talk about what we're hoping to do in the Civil Infrastructure and Lifeline Systems Committee, CILSC, and I'm the chairperson for that committee. And what we're doing is it's kind of related to this framework, but what FEMA and NIST did over the past few years is this idea of functional recovery that came out of the earthquake field. And the idea is, how do you design for recovery? We don't design for recovery right now. We design for life safety. That's it. Buildings should not collapse and kill people. There should be safe egress out of a building, but you don't use it. Well, if the idea is to recover and you can't use that building, well, you're not going to recover that building. So that's the waste. You got to demolish and spend the money and the time to do all of that. From an infrastructure system like water or wastewater or electric power, you don't want to demolish the whole thing. But we only actually design for life safety. And that really only gets down to the component level, not the system service level. There is nothing in the United States that gives guidance on what performance these systems should have after any type of an event. There wasn't even guidance in New Orleans about how the levee should perform after the flood, as an example. So that's where the country is attempting to head. I had the fortunate opportunity to work on the initial items on functional recovery for earthquakes for FEMA and NIST, and then to follow up on two key things, which is creating frameworks that would be related. I'm beginning to realize the world is frameworks of frameworks and systems of systems. Right, exactly. And it really is. So it's just a bunch of processes of systems in the grand scheme of things. So based on what I just said, one thing that we need are recovery guidelines. What are the service recovery guidelines for earthquakes or other hazards? But right now we've only worked on earthquakes because the federal funding came in through the earthquake programs. But we're some draft frameworks for identifying how to consistently create a set of recovery objectives for all of the different systems that are compatible. So, for example, you can't have electric power wanting to restore their services to the water system in 30 days, but the water system needs to use the pumping from use that electric power to pump to a hospital within 3 days. That's incompatible. You can't have that. We need the electric power before the water system needs to use that pump. Right. Or before they run out of, if they have backup generators, which all do not, before they run out of fuel. And if you need to refuel, you need transportation to refuel, right? So all of these things are interconnected. So they have to have a set of consistent performance objectives. How do you do that? We don't have any way of knowing how to do that. They're all working in silos and guessing what they're going to do, and they're telling the community, but the community doesn't know what they need, right? So we got to create that process. So that framework is drafted, and I'm hoping that that could go through the Infrastructure Resilience Division to create some guidelines, and that might take time. That will take time to do. Then on top of that, we need design requirements for how to design for recovery. That design has to meet these performance objectives that I just mentioned. So those performance objectives are the input to the design guidelines that are necessary. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, last year, and this time last year, I think it was in March actually, released a framework that I had the opportunity to help lead for how to design for functional recovery. What if I were to interpret that more closely to layman's terms, it would be, how do you design a system and all of its components to be able to recover within the time frame that the community needs, and how each member of the community needs it, right? Because I mentioned earlier that a hospital needs water and power before the recreational park needs water or power. So how do you decipher these things? How do we establish this? So there's a design framework for that. I'm hoping to bring that forward into the Infrastructure Resilience Division and begin to establish some guidelines that can get out to the communities across the country and around the world so that we can start to mobilize these things into practice.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay, let me make another announcement. If you've got questions, please put them in the chat and Brad will relay them to us. I'm going to ask one more question, Craig, and see if we get any more questions in the interim. Let's see here. You know, there's the first of 8 elements is to define the infrastructure resilience domain. Why is it necessary to have this element if the framework is for infrastructure resilience, infrastructure system resilience? Excuse me.
Yeah, that's a good question because that comes across people's minds. So the first element is to define the infrastructure system. That became actually one of the founding elements in 2 different phases of work that I've done. One, I was the person asked by the board, ASCE, to create the Infrastructure Resilience Division. And the first thing I found when I was working with everybody who was helping to formulate the Infrastructure Resilience Division is that we're all over the map on what we thought infrastructure resilience was.
Right.
Turns out that most people think of it in terms of what we describe as community resilience or social resilience or economic resilience. And what people tend to do, including the operators of these systems themselves, they tend to think of not the resilience of the system, but how the services from that system are used to create a resilient community.
Mm-hmm.
But resilience is the recovery of something.
Right.
And it's got to be, from our perspective in civil engineering, it's got to be recovery of the infrastructure, not so that it helps the community. It's not how the services are used. That's somebody else's job. Right, so the economist would think about, well, I need these services to make money. The business person, I need the water, the power, the natural gas to make my product. Well, that's not what the infrastructure is doing. That's what the business is doing. So we need to first and foremost define what infrastructure system we're actually talking about. I have been into many meetings with civil engineers that give a presentation on infrastructure resilience. It's all about the economy. That's how the services are used, but they actually don't talk about how to make the system itself resilient. Right. So to prevent that from cascading throughout and continuing with confusion, we just set that as a primary element. Step into number 1, what infrastructure system are you talking about? Are you talking about a building, a set of buildings, a water system, a power system? Define that first. Then define what hazards are you worried about. Is it just earthquake? Is it hurricane? Is it flood? Is it tornadoes? What is it? Is it all of the above? Okay, then address all of the above. But you probably have to do them one at a time before you can do them together. And so that's how we march through, and that's why we have that first element. But you do notice that when we loop back, I looped back for the iteration into element 2, because once you define it once, you're sticking with that system or that set of systems that you originally defined in element 1. So when you're iterating, you probably don't really need to go back and iterate through element 1. That's why it iterates back through element 2.
Awesome. Excellent. Awesome. Well, I think that gives everything kind of perspective, and in a nutshell, why I think this book is so good, but also why it's also different, right? Because there's a lot out there in terms of resilience. And so, yeah, I wanted to kind of highlight that because it's really important. So I don't think that we have any further questions. I don't see any yet. And so I'm going to hand this back off to Brad.
And when I pop back on magically, yeah, that means to the road. Craig, thank you for doing that presentation and for entertaining the questions from the audience. And Naveed, great job moderating today. For our viewers, thanks for being here. Thanks for asking questions. We know it's tough, it's for some reason it's very different than putting your hand up in a room. I don't know what it is. Maybe someday I'll get into the psyche of this. We do have the link for Craig's book, or Craig's edited book. I never know the right terminology for that. The book of which Craig was the editor and of which he spoke today. How about that? The link is in the chat, so you can go purchase it. Remember the discount code that Leslie showed at the beginning of the episode. You can go back, just scroll back to the beginning if you need to get that so that you can type it in and save 10%. We would love for you to do that. Discounts, we love discounts apparently. So thanks again to all our viewers for being with us today. Again, click like, subscribe, and get notifications. And if you do those things, we will let you know every time we post something to the YouTube channel. Next live stream is, well, the next one's scheduled for now. We have a big surprise coming that may be between now and then. But the next scheduled live stream right now is May 13th. And it is a special episode of GeoStrata Extra that will commemorate and celebrate the 25th anniversary of the magazine. We'll have a panel looking at the past, present, and future of GeoStrata, taking you back to all those great issues you loved, talking about where the magazine has come and what's coming down the road for it. You don't want to miss that one. You can register for it and all of our other live streams on our Eventbrite page. And it is, of course, part of the 3rd annual Geopalooza in May, where we will have content every day for 13 consecutive days, including the weekends. You don't want to miss out on that. So Craig and Naveed, thank you so much again for doing this today. I hope it was fun.
It was a pleasure. Awesome.
Yeah, it was great. I appreciate you having me, Brad.
That's always what we go for. We need to make sure everybody has a good time. Our producer today was Aurora Flieger, and we will see everybody again very soon.